Welcome to Life by Design, episode 300. Welcome to Life by Design. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Cratio Jug.
I like the pause. By my colleague, pause. This suit is great. Pause. Nuts.
We are creators of Life by Design with 25 certified locations worldwide. Each week on the show, we discuss the principles and the practice of Life by Design. Cratio, today we're talking about why good posture matters. I think posture is always an interesting conversation. It's something that, if we look back, been handed down by our grandparents and great-grandparents and parents. Stand up taller, don't slouch, sit up straight. And you wonder, does that matter? Does it make a difference? How does this relate to health? And if you've ever been to a corrective, structural, or Life by Design chiropractor, you know that looking at and measuring posture is something that is valuable and very important. So before we just talk about this topic in general, let me make one quick statement and I'll pass it back to you to have an opening comment here, Cratio. And that's,
Sure.
There is a difference between posture and structure. And we'll talk about that today. And I think it's a very fundamental, important thing. So posture is a word that's more popular for people. They understand the concept of posture, but there is a difference between posture and structure. And so, Krisha, I'll let you talk just a little bit about what posture is and why it's important. We'll probably dig into some of these ideas. Fire away.
Posture, to kind of open up you kind of opened up the conversation, but when people think posture, and when I think posture, I think aesthetically looking, right? Like you're going to look at somebody and you're going to look at the position of their head, of their shoulders. And I mean, it becomes a part of the conversation. And I was laughing at, stand up straighter and like our grandparents and our parents yelling at us, because part of it was how you present yourself, right? So there was a much more, the conversation was a lot bigger than just a physiological, structural comment on, well, this is how your body's structured. It was more like, you look like a disaster when you're sitting like that. So straighten up and have some pride, son. Like
Right.
carry yourself with some dignity. And a lot of people, when they talk about posture, I think that's the concern, right? Like I've yet to, or very rarely in my practice, do I hear a conversation around posture that doesn't end with, well, I don't want to end up with that big hump on my back.
Of course.
Right. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
However, to throw it back to you, there is a big difference between posture and structure, and they're both important in terms of your health and what you're going to get.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, if you had a postural problem, from a definition standpoint, the way I like to define it is a postural problem is something that is generally self-correctable almost instantaneously. So if someone is slouching over and, say, oh, you have bad posture, and I say, Cratio, just stand up tall, and you can stand up and you can reconstruct your body in a stacked up position where the ear is over the shoulder is over the hip over the knee, and the knee over the ankles. And you've got that gravitational line running through with the curve swinging back and forth through the gravitational line. Your spine is designed to work nicely in that position, very much like a spring. And a good example of losing that would be, and I'll use this with patients a lot, imagine if, Chris, you jumped off, say, a chair or a bench, but you kept your knees straight. Imagine how that would feel through your body. That's what it means to lose those normal structural curvatures in the spine. So it's meant to work in a cushy way that allows forces to be transmitted throughout the spine and the tissues in a healthy way. So posture is something that is self-correctable, at least very instantaneously. Structural problems, which may create a postural problem, by the way. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to discern in people is your postural problem really a postural problem, or is it a more structural problem? A structural problem is not something that is generally self-correctable. And without doing really extensive tests, if I saw somebody who looked or appeared to be in a postural shift, and I said, stand up tall, and they couldn't recreate that stacking, without other testing right away, I'm going to say that's very likely there's a structural problem. And if it's structural, it's a much bigger problem than just a postural problem. It not only affects the physical tissues, but it's going to take time in order to make that change. And so I think from a health perspective, both play a role. Obviously, a structural problem is going to be more significant, have greater impact on the physiology and on the body. Whereas a postural problem, if it's purely postural, it's something that you probably can play a much bigger role in and actually be involved in the changing of that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I like that. That's good.
Well, as it relates, Cratio, to the, talk about the dowager's hump that a lot of people see, and it was that a postural problem, that's more likely a structural problem. And, from a clinical standpoint, the dowager's hump, or what we actually call a hyperkyphosis of the thoracic spine, is not necessarily even the problem per se. It's really, we like to call it collateral damage. So let's say that the upper part of the spine, the neck, had gotten some type of malfunction, dysfunction, immobility, shifting, whatever we want to call it. And it created a situation where there was a weakening of those tissues. One of the things that happens over time, and I like this visual for people, is the spine literally begins to collapse on itself. And as the spine collapses on itself, the head moves into a forward position. The cervical curve goes from lordotic to alordotic, which means it goes from a C shape to a more straight or flattened out position. And the body's so amazing in that there becomes this other compensation. The other compensation for the top of the head shifting and the cervical curve losing its nice, healthy, structural stacked position is it creates a hyperkyphosis. And it's very interesting if you dig into some of this research, and it's being done outside of the chiropractic world, looking at hyperkyphosis and its role on physiology. And there's a handful of studies that have looked at hyperkyphosis specifically in aging populations. There's also one or two on hyperkyphosis or loss of disc height in men as they're aging. But basically, when we look at that, there's a huge effect. One of the effects in some of the studies is actually on longevity. So the more hyperkyphotic the spine becomes, the lower somebody's lifespan was. I think that's probably shocking to some people. You wouldn't necessarily think a postural, or in this case, a structural change could actually change lifespan. Now, I'm not suggesting it's causal, meaning the postural problem, structural problem is the issue causing lifespan, just saying that looking at that pattern also relates to a decreased lifespan. Now, part of the hypothesis in this group, Krish, was, looking at the collapsing of the structure, creating pulmonary problems. And because there's a pulmonary problem, that obviously we could start to figure out that's probably going to create a change in your longevity. The point, and then I'll pass it back, is that when the body doesn't work and the body gets weaker and the body malfunctions, it's always affecting all these different aspects, some of which get measured in these different studies, others that maybe aren't getting measured, but they're still happening. So we always go back to the principle. What's the ideal? What's the optimal? Anything that deviates away from that is bad. And how bad it is in terms of subjective measurements really is probably individual on each case based on all the other things that are going on. So clearly this hyperkyphosis is an issue, posture is an issue, and more importantly, as per our conversation today, if it's a structural issue, then it's an even bigger issue.
Yeah, I'm listening to this, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree, and I don't think that anyone's going to not, I don't think anyone's really going to be surprised when you tell them that if they're, for lack of scientific terminology, if their spine is a mess, that it's going to decrease the longevity. It's just interesting to me. It takes me back to, and I think I heard you talk about this first before I read the book. I think it was Stephen Covey, right? The things that fall under the urgent or not, not urgent,
Yep.
but important category.
Exactly.
And this is the thing, because this is one of those things that if you just started resolving as soon as possible, it wouldn't even be an effect later on in life. However, if it's left to too long, right? This is the patient that comes into your practice with severe scoliosis, severe degeneration, and in their 70s, they're just in complete agony all of the time because there's nothing that they can do anymore.
Yeah. Well, the way this really should be handled is in a pediatric sense, right? Where we're looking at structural problems earlier in somebody's life. And then if you want to look at this situation, the structural changes, it's unlikely that, something, knocked the spine out of position. Not to say that that can't happen, but I think what we're looking at more is an effective weakening of the structure. And so let's say different stresses are on the system, whether it be the way we move, it could be individual traumas, it could just be, literally psychological stress, or what most people would deem as stress. And those things affect the neurology of the body. We know they affect the brain. We know they create a fight or flight response in the body. We know that creates increased activation of the erector muscles in the spine. We know that it puts the body into a defense physiology. Have you ever seen a dog when they put their tail between their legs and they tuck their head down? Think about that in terms of the spinal mechanics of an adult. It's exactly what's happening. And if that's
Well,
happening,
going back,
go ahead.
sorry, going back full circle. That's why like your grandpa was like, listen, son, you need to walk around like this so you don't look like that.
Well, that's exactly it. Is whether they understood the full effects and the physiology and the pathophysiology of this, they understood that that's not ideal. They also understood this starts early in life. And so I like the idea of a corrective chiropractic approach really being about the optimal development of a child's spine and structure and their neurology, versus a therapeutic approach which says, okay, you have neck pain or back pain or some other sign of collateral damage and we're going to fix that. It just makes more sense to me that we measure the structure and we measure the neurology and we look for deviations away from optimal, not necessarily to the point where it's become pathological, but even just deviations away that show a dysfunction or some type of pathophysiological change where people can step in and say, okay, here we are 5% off the norm. Is there something I can do to bring myself back, or 20 or 30%, or something we can do to bring ourselves back? Because it's kind of like hitting a golf ball in the sense, where you line up. If your target is even 1 yard off in terms of the alignment, where that ends up 300 yards out after the drive is, 60 yards to the right.
I
And
think
the
it's
same is,
called, I think it's called the butterfly effect.
okay, well, it's the same idea here, right? Is
100%.
a
100%.
problem early in life becomes compounded over and over and
Multiplied.
over
Yep.
again. Whether it's physical structural we're talking about today, and to kind of go back to some of our think by design topics, it's the same thing. Setting gold standards for our kids, role modeling for them, really giving them guardrails as they're growing up and helping them develop their value systems. All the work that goes into that now, even though sometimes it's a huge pain in the butt and it's frustrating, and it's annoying and it's irritating, and it's so easy if you just want to give them an iPad every day and you think, oh man, having kids is so easy, until they become 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 18 and 40, and they're still living at home and making really bad decisions for themselves. And you think to yourself, man, I should have told them to stand up taller, or I should have told them to go outside and do this, or to work on whatever it was, or to help them with their value system. So,
or worse, how did this happen is worse.
Well, yes, exactly. You're right. You get to that point, you're like, oh, how do we get here? So yes, here's how you got here. You stopped helping them grow. You stopped being a parent. That parenting doesn't just apply to the think by design concepts, and that's really the topic for today, especially as it applies to kids. Parenting also means caring for them. It means looking out for them in a way that aids them in their physical health. I mean, I know for both of us and a lot of the kids who are involved in Life by Design, it's so exciting to watch them training in the fit club or at the CrossFit and eating by design and actually thinking about it. Like Andy being only 3.5, and I'm sure it's the same with your kids, she knows what food is good for her and what's bad for her. Even if, she goes somewhere and we let her have like a gluten-free English muffin. Not only is she stoked about it, but she can tell us, she's like, oh, this is one that's good for my belly, or it's okay, but it's only a treat. This isn't something we should eat all the time. And she's 3.5. So, how is that going to translate 5 years from now, 10 years from now and forward? Same thing with her spine. My kids, it's amazing. There's not a day go by where they're like, can I get checked? Can I get checked? Can I get checked? Like they just get it. They want to be on the table. They want to get checked. And not because they have any type of physical symptom, although there's times when they do. It's because they recognize that getting checked and corrected if necessary, which is important to note here for people listening in, or if you're new to the podcast, corrected if necessary is a portion of the optimization blueprint. And posture is just one sign that optimization blueprint is not being essentially completed as per necessary. Now, I'm going to pass it back to you, but let me just add this one piece. Don't wait until there becomes a major postural deviation, or don't wait until there becomes a more pathological structural change. These are things that should be done essentially from day one and throughout in an appropriate way for kids, teens, adults, applied properly.
Do they still do scoliosis screenings for kids at school? Like, is that
I
still
don't
something that,
believe
like,
so. I don't believe
yeah,
so.
because that was like the first, I remember that. I remember we had to do that
Yeah,
when I
we
was
never
a kid.
did.
But yeah, but I mean, here's the point, right? It comes down to, because it comes down to this idea. Well, they do that. No, if you can pick up a scoliotic curve. So let's be clear on what the scoliosis screening is. It's literally bend over and let me look at your spine as you're bending over. By the time something like that shows up, right, you already have a scoliosis.
Right.
Right. It's very similar, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of this stuff. I'm saying that it's not as it's not as advanced, or it's not as early as people would like to think. It's like a
Sure.
lot of times with the early cancer screenings. Like, if those early screenings come back positive, you already have the disease. Like, they just
Right.
caught it earlier on.
Yeah,
So, like,
early diagnosis is not health.
right, and that's exactly my point, right? My point is, we want health, we want optimization. I've never met a parent who doesn't want the absolute best for their children, and best means that you're proactively doing something before a problem even shows up, with the idea not to avoid this problem, but the idea is, this is the best for my kid.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what we need to do, guys, it's actually very simple. Number one, make sure your child has had their spine and nervous system examined by a corrective chiropractor, someone who's an expert in this area. Number two, make posture important. Go back to the old school days, stand up tall, sit up straight. Be very cognizant of how your kids are using their phones, their digital devices, and how much they're using them. And then it's not just about this passive approach of don't stand up, don't tip over, don't be hunched. It's also an active process of we need to train our bodies. Train. Yes, your kids, oh, my kid's only 3.5. So do they have a body? Are they alive? Are they breathing? They need to
Should it
train
move?
that body, right? Exactly. This is not something where, we should implement a training program once our child is overweight from playing too many video games, or eating the wrong foods. This is something that needs to be implemented now, ASAP. So these are things they can do at home. They could be doing push-ups, they could be doing burpees, they could be planking, they could be doing air squats. There's all kinds of things they can do. You don't even need an organized system to do it, but you need to deal with, is there a mechanical, structural, neurological problem? Get checked. Let's go ahead and pay more attention. So there's an awareness component, and then there's an actual active corrective component that you can do on your own. So go to the show notes, guys. We put a couple articles in there about posture. We also put in the free Move by Design ebook. You can grab that there at lifebydesign.com/podcast. And thank you, as always, for joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.